questions at the end. Okay, so where we left off last time was the settlement of Jamestown in Virginia. Again, just to recap, that is a business venture created by joint stock companies in an attempt to, seek out new riches in the new world. And what they realize quickly, maybe not as quickly enough, is that there are no more gold mines, right? There are no more Aztec empires or Inca empires. They are going to have to grow their produce. Or whatever it is that's going to make them money. That takes a while. They begin with tobacco cultivation, and they end up being a very agrarian society. They're spread out. They don't live in tight-knit communities, and their main purpose, is economic. They're there to make money. But moving on into the New England settlements, right? So we're moving up to Massachusetts, and what will become Massachusetts. I'm going to share my screen with you real quick and pull up this for you. All right. So this is where you see the Puritans come into play. So the Puritans are Protestants, and I know we talked about the Protestant Reformation last time, and the Puritans want to purify the Church of England. They want to stay within the church, but they want to purify it, hence the term Puritan. And they are called non-separatists. They're different from what we would call pilgrims. Pilgrims are people who are also Protestants, but they kind of believe that the church is unredeemable, right? It's gone too far, it's too corrupt. And so they are separatists. They believe they have to start again, start anew. And they come to the New World to do that. Their original plan was to go to Virginia and just settle a new area around Jamestown and create this new society. But that doesn't work out, right? And we'll talk about why in just a second. So when they are attempting to, they've decided to leave, right, the old world or Europe, a lot of what we're taught in grade school and up until probably high school is that Puritans and Pilgrims were fleeing religious persecution. They came over to the New World because they wanted to practice their religion freely. And to a certain extent, that is true, okay? But what they also don't say is that Puritans were very good at persecuting other people. In fact, once we talk about the English Civil War, you'll kind of see what I mean. Puritans were very domineering and very strict in their adherence to the literal interpretation of the Bible. They were a large group of them in England, but then they went to Amsterdam, in Holland, and then they were also in France for a while because they pretty much irritated everyone they were around. So were they fleeing? To a certain extent, yes. Was Europe sad to see them leave? Absolutely not, right? And it worked out well for them, okay? And so what they do is they come together and they come as entire family units, okay? They sorry. Let me move back to see what's going on in the chat here. Sorry. Okay. I just want to. I keep hearing the chat coming up. I just want to make sure you guys weren't trying to raise your hand. Okay. So they come together and they travel as entire congregations. So they come as family units within a whole congregation of their church. Okay, and so they start in 1622, and that's the first kind of expedition over. But they leave in September, which is not very well thought out because even if they get to Virginia in the next 6 to 8 weeks, it's going to be winter, right? And lo and behold, as they are coming across, they get blown off course and they don't land in Virginia. They land in the Cape Cod area, right, which is now Massachusetts. And so they realize very quickly that they're in unfounded territory. So what they do is they go back to the ship, which is named the Mayflower, and they create this contract amongst everyone on the ship about how they're going to set up this kind of new colony, because they realize that they are in no position to go try and find Virginia. And this document, which is signed by everyone, is called the Mayflower Compact. Okay. And so they kind of set up, they land Plymouth Rock, the infamous name of that, and they begin creating small communities. Now, differences between, say, New England or Massachusetts and Virginia. Both genders come. They come as family units, which, as we said, was a big problem for Virginia, only coming as men. They come as whole congregations and communities built in, so that helps secure their safety. They are there to start a new life. Their entire purpose for coming to the New World was different from Virginia. Virginia was about making money. Massachusetts is about building a new life. And they want to create a city on the hill, is what they call it, a beacon of light to humanity. This is the way you should live. Puritans, as we said, are very devout. Puritans are also more literate. You have 100% literacy. Granted, they mostly read the Bible, that's all they read, but they all read, right? They teach their children to read, both genders. So you have a very literate society coming over here. And once you have kind of news coming back across the Atlantic that they're successful, they've built this, they do make friends with the Pequots, which are the Native American tribe. They trade with them, and they kind of pick up farming techniques from them. You have the creation of the Massachusetts Bay Company, and that's in 1629. And this is kind of a joint stock company created by Pilgrims and Puritans in order to fund basically this exodus to the New World, right? To transport these large congregations of Puritans to the New World. And they have huge numbers, in the thousands Puritans come across. And they don't go through anything like the starving time, right? They don't have a dip in population. So in 1630, they officially create the colony of Massachusetts, right? And they ensure local self-government with the company charter, right? And a lot of this is based on the Mayflower Compact, which most people agree would be like the first written form of self-government in the New World. I mean, in the British 13 colonies. But for our purposes, right, they bring the company charter. And we're not going to go through Winthrop. There you go. Now, I will say this, as when we start talking about voting and participation in self-government, the difference between Virginia and Massachusetts is that in Virginia, the qualifications were that you were male, that you owned property, and that you were white. Okay? In Massachusetts, the qualifications were male, white, church member. Okay, so you can see right then the difference in what they view as important, right? The Virginians view land and wealth as important, and the New Englanders view religion, your attachment to a congregation, as important. So as the Puritans come in and the Pilgrims come in droves, and they start to expand out their communities, they require more land. This puts them in direct confrontation with the Pequots. And the Pequot War is pretty violent. And the reason we kind of mention this, and again, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but the colonists do take prisoners of war, right? They take prisoners of the Pequots and they enslave them. But they then take them down to Virginia and trade them for enslaved Africans. So you do see slavery in New England, but it's in a much smaller amount, and it's usually in exchange for these Native American POWs, whereas in Virginia, you have the first recorded sale of an enslaved person in 1619. Okay, so Virginia is using this for labor. They're going to bring in slavery for increased labor needs. Um, and New England is also going to use them for labor, but to a much lesser extent. And mainly they are exchanging POWs for that. And the reason they do this is because having Native Americans within their communities that are local means that they can run away, or they can spy, or they can, create mischief within the community. So if you go down to Virginia and you trade them for enslaved Africans who are not local to this area, um, in their mind, that's more beneficial. But you see here that Puritans can be very hypocritical, right? Uh, which is pretty true for most very devout religions. And the issue is, right, why are we enslaving people when that's not exactly in the New Testament, right? And the other issues that the Puritans have um, sorry, um, dissenters. So they call dissenters. The New Englanders again are going to settle differently. We talked about how in Jamestown they settle apart from each other on large farms, but that not only does not build a sense of community, but it also does not provide a lot of protection, right? But that also goes back to they are tobacco farmers, so they need these large tracts of land. So in New England, you're going to see them live in very tight-knit communities. So they all live in the village, right? They all live close together. And their farmland extends beyond the village, right? Goes further past the village, and they all have farmland, right? They all have tracts, but the farm can be separate from where they live. So they have to live within the community, and then they have these huge plots of land, right, that they are farming. Most of the time, they're not that big. They're farming for subsistence, which means they are farming just to feed their families and maybe have a little extra for their neighbors, right? Most of them are family units doing this, and you're going to see a lot of children, right? They have many children, not only because even in the Puritan communities there is a high infant mortality rate, but also you need help on the farm, right? So you have more children. Again, we did talk about slavery, that slavery existed. There was absolutely no freedom of religion. You have to attend church, and they enforce morality. So there's this phrase that they use in their writings called keeping a holy watchfulness, right? And what that means is that they need to look out for their neighbors. In other words, if they notice that one of their neighbors is sick, then they bring food and they take care of their family until their neighbor gets better. If they realize, you know, that a cow is ill or something, that they go and help provide milk for that family. So it's a very community-based thing, and it means to look out for your neighbor, look out for one another, and serve the community, right, within the church. And so this, right, seems like a very positive thing, and it is, but it's also a double-edged sword because it also means you have the right to be super nosy. And if you don't show up to church on Sunday, they will come find you. They will come ask you, why weren't you there? And you better be really sick. So they do that. And to a certain extent, they spy on their neighbors. But in their mind, put it this way, their point of doing this was to take care of one another. Okay. But you do have instances of which you have neighbors that are little tattletales, and they report to the deacon, they report to the priest that, or pastor, what you've been doing or what you haven't been doing, or if you're drinking or not drinking, and spanking your kids and if you're a woman speaking out of turn or speaking at all, really. So all of these things kind of go along with the whole package. But like we said, they don't go through the starving time. They don't have large dips in population due to diseases. They do very well from the get-go. So they have that going for them. All right, now what happens to people who don't toe the line for Puritans? And actually, the two most famous dissenters are Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson. Okay, and they are not people who decided Puritanism is too strict, I'm not doing that. They are actually too Puritan for the Puritans. Um, and this is where you see a little coming into play in the Puritan faith. So Roger Williams was hired as a minister, and he was a friend of Winthrop, who's the governor of Massachusetts, and he's preaching and he's doing a very good job. But what he says is that you should buy the land from the Native Americans. You should not steal it, right? And this apparently is a big deal. They don't like it. And you would think, not stealing is a pretty big one in the Bible, right? It's in the top 10. So not preaching not to steal from your neighbors seems like a pretty no-brainer for us. But for those in New England at the time, they thought this was salacious, and they were not pleased by this. So the governor comes to him and he says, look, this is not very popular, right, idea here that you've got, and maybe you should tone it down. And Roger Williams says, no. I will preach what I will preach, and it's in the Bible, and this is what's going to happen. So even the governor can't save him, and they expel him. They decide that he is too radical, right? Mostly because he's calling out their greed. But he's expelled, and he moves further south, and he actually sets up the colony of Rhode Island. And he allows for religious freedom. He continues preaching, but you see a lot of people from Massachusetts that for whatever reason don't get along with the Puritans end up in Rhode Island. Okay? And our next one, Anne Hutchinson, she is quite a lady. She is a midwife in the community. She's very well regarded. She has 13 children of her own. That's 1-3. Yeah, and they are all alive. They all live. She is, like I said, she's very well read, very well respected in the community, and she begins holding Bible study in her home for women, only for women, because, the literal interpretation of the Bible says that only men can preach, or only men should be speaking when you're in mixed company. So she's holding these female Bible studies, and the men don't like it. And they don't like it because, women could be getting ideas of their own, and we can't have that. So they tell the minister, and they tell, the county judge, she's doing these things in her home, and they bring her in to ask her about it, say, are you really doing this? And she says, yes, I'm doing this. And it says so in the Bible. It says that elderly Christian women should instruct younger Christian women when there is no man present on the ways of the Bible, how to live your life in the Lord, and be a good wife and or daughter, etc. So the Bible supports me in this. I said she's very well read. And they tell her, stop doing it. You have to listen to us. Then obviously we know better. The misogyny is ripe in Massachusetts. So she doesn't. She doesn't stop doing it. She continues to have Bible study in her home. And they bring her up on charges. And so she comes to court and defends herself successfully. She lists all the places in the Bible where it supports what she's doing, and she pokes holes in all of their accusations and the case that they're trying to make against her doing this. And basically, they cannot find a reason why she's doing anything illegal, so they cannot punish her. because the law code of Massachusetts is pretty strict on that. But they tell her she's got to get out. They won't have her in Massachusetts. So again, these two, Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson, are not bucking the system as far as it's too strict. They are actually saying, no, you guys need to be even more adherent to the Bible, right? And that doesn't go over well. So they get expelled uh, and begin life again in Rhode Island, right? So just briefly about the hurricane, then we can move on to the English Civil War in Chapter 3. The Caribbean is a gold mine, really, during this time, right? You have the French, Dutch, and English, and the Spanish suffer from hurricanes. Christopher Columbus actually starts to figure out hurricane season. And a lot of them know that you need to get, depending on where you're going in Europe, you need to get out of there. You need to get out of the Caribbean by, say, August, right? And we know why is that? Well, that's because that's when the hurricane season starts, right? I mean, well, it doesn't start in August, it starts in June. But the storms come in that August, September. So, can I help you? What do you need? I know. I'm sorry. Okay, so all of them are competing over islands in the Caribbean. Jamaica is the jewel of the Caribbean, if you will, and it's owned by all of them at some point. And why Jamaica? Because it has Port Royal, which is easily defended. It also has lots of sugar canes and plantations, etc. So sugarcane plantations. So Jamaica, like I said, is the jewel of the Caribbean. And so when we see situations with the English arise, you find that many times the English, the French, and the Dutch will give up things in North America to keep control of islands in the Caribbean, because they are worth so much more.
Oh, that makes me trap.
I'm sorry, give me just 1 second. Lily, I'm really busy. You have to take this over for yourself. Okay, go ahead. Watch something else. Okay, sorry about that. All right. So sugar cultivation, right, is the main reason the Caribbean is so sought after, and why these islands are worth protecting, right? For example, Jamaica makes more money for the English crown than the entire 13 colonies put together. Right? That's kind of cash flow we're talking about here. And so the sugar trade becomes huge. It really becomes kind of the basis for the global exchange. Everybody wants sugar. Sugar goes with almost everything, right? And tea and coffee and transportation to Asia, the sugar in the Caribbean. So you kind of see this slave trade beginning to circle around. But as we've talked about before, the Spanish and the Portuguese bring lots of European diseases into the New World through the Columbian Exchange. And the Native Americans, whom they've enslaved to grow this sugar for them, are dying off in large numbers. So they look for the other labor source, and it's the Portuguese who bring over the enslaved Africans. Right? They are the main conduits, the Portuguese are, for enslaved Africans for the transatlantic slave trade. But you'll also see, the Spanish, the English, and the Dutch will do some slave trading of their own. Others just buy from the Portuguese. All right. So you see a large expansion of the slave trade in the 1800s due to this effort to expand sugar plantations. Okay. Any questions about chapter 2? No. Okay. So next, thing we're going to talk about is going into chapter 3, and this is the English Civil War. Again, we're going to briefly run through this, so don't worry about trying to write down these slides. Also, they're on Blackboard, so you can look at them at a later date. But the English Civil War is just an expansion, right, on all that drama I told you about on Tuesday. So Henry VIII, right, he has the 3 children. Elizabeth I is the only one that actually serves for any period of time. She's Protestant, but she has no children. So she names as her heir James VI of Scotland, who becomes James I, which is why the town is named Jamestown, right? His mother is Mary, Queen of Scots. Excuse me. And as you can see there, they're distantly related. Henry VIII and James' grandmothers were siblings. So James's grandma, Mary, Queen of Scots' mother, is a sister of Henry VIII. So that's how you get the connection, right? And he becomes James I of Great Britain. This is how you unite England and Scotland, okay? Now, he has 2 boys. Charles, he has actually other children too, but Charles I is his oldest boy, all right? And Charles takes over after his father. Charles is Protestant, but between the years of 1625, 1649, Charles wants to be more independent of Parliament. He wants to rule like an autocrat, which means like he wants to have all of the authority. And Parliament in England is not set up that way. And evolving over the centuries, they've seen more and more limits on the power of the monarch and more power put in the hands of the people, i.e. the Parliament. But one of the duties that monarchs have to do every year is officially open the session of Parliament. Queen Elizabeth does it even today, right? And it's mostly a ceremonial duty for her. But in 1625, or in the reign of Charles I, he gets very annoyed with Parliament, pretty much not doing what he wants and or not giving him very much money. And so he refuses to open Parliament for over 10 years. This does not go over well, right? Parliament is very upset. People are upset. But technically they can't meet unless he opens the session, okay? He has 2 children. The first one by his first wife, and his first wife is Protestant, so the son, Charles II, is Protestant. Wife number 1 dies. He marries wife number 2, who's a princess of France and Catholic. He has another child with her, James II, who is Catholic. And things are not going well, right, with Parliament. When he does finally open Parliament back up again, having been not opened for, I think, 11 years, the reason he opens them is because he wants more money, because he can't tax without Parliament, and he's running out of money. And so he's like, well, I need more money, and they're like, no, and not just no, but what you've done is treason, and now we're going to charge you. So he's put on trial for treason against the people, and he loses. He's found guilty, and they cut his head off. Okay, so his family hightails it over to France to stay with, mom and stepmom's family, right, in safety. And who's in charge now? Well, this erupts right into a civil war between those who support the king and those who support Parliament. And the person who champions Parliament is a guy named Oliver Cromwell. And he's the leader of the military. The military supports Parliament in charging the king with treason and killing him. So Oliver Cromwell is a Puritan, and he really reforms the armed forces and makes it a lot more successful. We don't rape people, we shouldn't be drunk on duty, that type of thing. So he really cleans up the military, and he's quite popular in that accord. But as a person, no, you wouldn't want to hang out with him. No, there's no going to have a beer with Oliver Cromwell for sure. So he kind of becomes a de facto dictator because he realizes Parliament needs him a lot more than he needs Parliament. Because without him, there's no way that they would have been able to successfully defeat the loyal supporters of the crown. And being a Puritan, what he does is he starts to institute Puritanism within the government of England. So between 1609 and 1660, 11 years, Oliver Cromwell rules England. They call this the Commonwealth period. And he tries to turn everybody into a Puritan, basically. Very unpopular. He shuts down all of the bars, all of the gambling dens, the theaters, the brothels. People are arrested for cursing in public. So immodest clothing, right? All of the things, anything that's really any fun, right? He shuts that down. So very unpopular for that. And then the last straw is kind of when he cancels Christmas. So Christmas, right, at its core is a religious holiday. But it also coincides with a pagan holiday, and it's always traditionally been the Yuletide, and everybody comes together and feasting and presents and just this huge celebration. But according to the Puritans, A, it should be a solemn religious occasion. B, you should be celebrating the birth of Jesus Christ, not this commercialized, etc. And even the Puritans admit that we probably got the date wrong anyway. Jesus was probably born in March. And most of the time they believe you should celebrate Easter more than Christmas because that's when he died, and was resurrected. So there are, issues there. But he cancels Christmas. Anybody who isn't just going to a religious service on Christmas is arrested. So as you can see, he is not fun, not a good guy. He dies in 1660 of natural causes, right? He catches a fever or something. So luckily Parliament doesn't have to do anything about him. And in 1660, they decide to formally ask Charles II, right? His dad was the one that got his head cut off, to return to England, assume the role as monarch, but there's going to be restrictions, right? And he understands that he's being asked to come back, and they didn't have to ask him. So they actually have a pretty good relationship as far as they look at each other as equals, Parliament and Charles II. He is a Protestant. He's married to a princess of Portugal, I think. And unfortunately, they don't have any children. She's unable to have children. And we know this because Charles II had 3 or 4 very long relationships with mistresses. He had a whole lot of kids with them. I mean, the guy had like 21 children or something, just an insane amount. But to his credit, he did not divorce his wife, and he remained married to her for the rest of her life. So what's the issue with Charles? Charles II is actually a pretty decent king, and he passes in 1679 the Habeas Corpus Act, right? And the Habeas Corpus Act basically says that you have to have a reason for arresting somebody, and you have to charge them with a crime. You cannot detain somebody without charging them with a crime, right? Which means that as king, you can't walk by and be like, I don't like that guy. I don't like the way he looked at my wife. Throw him in jail forever, because they could do that before. But after 1679, you had to have a charge. There had to be a real reason to incarcerate somebody. A lot of this is going to bleed over into the United States law code too, so that's why we keep bringing it up. He has no male heirs, and his brother is quite Catholic, has never really hidden the fact that he's Catholic. And so the issue, though, is that James II, although he's pretty well known as Catholic, married, his first wife was Protestant, and they had 2 girls, Mary and Anne, and they were both Protestants. Okay, well, his first wife dies, and then he remarries a Catholic woman. And Parliament is not, they're willing to kind of grin and bear it until James II dies, because his daughters are going to take over, and they're Protestant, right? So they've already killed one king. They'd rather not repeat it in the same century. But then his second wife is pregnant and has a boy. And this is a huge problem. because as a boy, he will precede Mary and Anne in the line of succession, and he's Catholic. Okay, so huge to do about it. We cannot have a Catholic on the throne again. And so while England is going through all of this, right, what's happening in the Americas? They're pretty much left alone. They're pretty much left to their own devices. So again, this is all going to come into play as reasons why and long-standing grievances against the English when we start talking about the road to independence and the European wars they end up getting caught up in. So the Americas have very limited control from the English. They have very few taxes. They're not really enforced because the English are busy, right? They're busy arguing over religion a lot. So what happens to James II? Well, Parliament is not willing to just sit and let another Catholic boy take over. So James II is forced to abdicate, and his daughter, Mary, his oldest daughter, Mary, who's married to William of Orange, invades. The William of Orange is Dutch, and they become King William and Queen Mary. So he is pushed out by his own daughter, right? Family means nothing when we're talking about the crown. And the royal families of Europe, they'll eat their own, it seems like. So he's out. He goes back to France with his young son, and his two daughters stay in England. And so we have King William and Queen Mary. They rule from 1689 to 1702. They call that the Glorious Revolution when James is pushed out and these two come in. For two reasons. They call it the Glorious Revolution because it's about religion and because nobody died, right? There was no bloodshed. James II leaves peacefully, and you have these new Protestants on the throne. And shortly after that, they make a law saying that if you're going to be the English monarch, if you're going to be on the throne, you have to be Protestant. So they will never have to deal with that again. So these two are good monarchs, and you have one of the first universities in Virginia is named the College of William and Mary for these two. They create the English Bill of Rights, right, which denotes even further how you must respect the rights of Englishmen, right, as a government. So what's happening here, right, is a more limit on government and monarch power. After William and Mary have several children, but none of them live out to adulthood. So her sister Queen Anne takes over in 1702. She's also married, has several children, but none of them live to adulthood or even past childhood. So sad, but kind of that's the end of the Stuart line, so the Tudors, the Stuarts. So where do you go now? They end up looking through, again, more cousins, and these cousins come from Hanovera, call them the Hanoverians, and those are the Georges, right? George the First, George the Second, George the Third, but we'll stop that there. Now, the issue with the Civil War, like I said, that was really a brief summary of what actually goes on. There's a lot more to it, but for the purposes of our class, that's enough. What it does is it impacts the colonies in several ways. The first of which is that you don't see a lot of support and or control. So the crown doesn't come in and institute, a bunch of laws, a bunch of taxes, etc., that they might have if they were more secure at home. You see, this changing of religion from one to the other, and you lose your head if you're not the right religion, or your children are deposed, or you're forced to abdicate. So you're going to see this bleed into when they create the Constitution and the early forms of government in the American Republic, why separation of church and state is a big, right? The other thing, that you're going to want to kind of look at is that stability at home definitely has an impact on the colonies. And There is this detachment of, the English really don't know what uh, what is going on in the New World or in their colonies for a long time because they're so busy trying to keep up with what is going on back home. So, any questions over that so far? Okay, see a lot of names, so good job. If you haven't put your name on there, please put your name on there. Um, and we'll move on to chapter 3. Okay. So the reason, right, that I brought up the Civil War before we kicked in on this, although the Civil War is part of chapter 3, is that we're starting to flesh out the other colonies. Because so far, right, we've only talked about Virginia and Massachusetts. So there's a colony that starts just north of Virginia called Maryland. And this one was in chapter 2, but we can talk about it now. Maryland is actually a land grant that was given to the Calvert family. So when James II is on the throne and he sees the writing on the wall, right? He's the Catholic. His daughter's going to come in and depose him. But the Calvert family has always been very loyal to him and his family and supported them, lent them money even. So he owes the Calverts money. So he gives them a whole land grant in the New World as payment and also kind of as a way out. Because he says, look, this is not going to end well for Catholics. And you are a prominent, well-known Catholic family, and you've always supported me, and I'm going to give you this land grant. You take your titles, you take your family, go to the New World, right? You'll be safe there. Okay? So they do. And the Calvert family, his title was Lord Baltimore, which is why, right? You have Baltimore, Maryland. They name their land grant after Queen Mary. And you have Maryland. But Maryland is also, as we said, right next door to Virginia, just north of Virginia. And so it's very agrarian. It allows religious freedom. You do see a lot of Catholics migrating there from England, but it allows for other religions too. And it grows tobacco. And it is, like we said, a much a farming community. All right. But then moving, so we have Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Virginia, and Maryland. So New York was actually already established by the Dutch. The Dutch called it New Amsterdam, and they used it as a trading post and a port, right? And it was large. And they purchased it from the Native American tribes there. So they traded in a skirmish with the English to remain in control of their Caribbean islands. So again, the Caribbean is really important, and it plays a huge role in kind of settlement and economics of the New World. So the Dutch, in order to keep control of their Caribbean ports, give up New Amsterdam. And the English gather this new port, and this is under Charles, and he gives this to his brother James, the Duke of York. So he renames it New York, right? The Duke of York is the title always given to second in line. So, for example, in present times, you have Queen Elizabeth II in Great Britain. Her first son, Prince Charles, he's the Prince of Wales. Her second son, Prince Andrew, is the Duke of York. And you may know about him because he's embroiled in the Jeffrey Epstein thing. So the Duke of York is always the second in line. He takes it over, names it New York, and really kind of allows anybody and everybody to move in there. He doesn't impose a lot of control. The New York heterogeneous means different, diverse, right? So the New York population is very diverse, whereas Massachusetts is all Puritans. Rhode Island is mostly Puritans, Pilgrims, but English. Virginia is kind of a mix, but you do see a lot of English there. Maryland is more diverse, but New York has a lot more diversity. It's probably one of the most diverse colonies in the New World. Okay, New Jersey is was originally part of New York, but the Duke broke it up and gave this to the Carteret and Berkeley family for payment. And this is one thing that you're going to see the English do a little bit differently than the Spanish and the Portuguese and the French, is that they're using land as currency because they are land rich but cash poor, right? So he gives this land grant to these two families. They set up New Jersey. Again, New Jersey's just south of New York, right across the river. That's set up in 64, so just after the restoration of the monarchy. Um, they promised land, religious toleration. They have their own form of self-government as legislation. And you have a lot of migration coming to New York and New Jersey. They're both, right, they both have coastal parts of their colony. The New York is quickly becoming the largest port in the New World in the 13 colonies anyway. And today, New York handles the most goods. It's the largest port by volume of goods that go through there. Houston is the largest port by geographic region. Right? In other words, by size, land size, Houston is larger. So New York and New Jersey are originally part of that land grant to the Duke. Pennsylvania, also given to a friend of the crown, a guy named William Penn, founds Pennsylvania. He's a Quaker. And Quakers are Protestants. They're pacifists, meaning they're against war. They're anti-violent, peaceful, and friendly. In fact, Quakers, they still have congregations around Houston, actually. They still have congregations around the United States. They call them the Circle of Friends. And they're not just a company that makes oatmeal, okay? But they are very, again, like I said, very peaceful and very welcoming. So they promote migration, again, like I said, similar to New Jersey. Pennsylvania grows very quickly. Philadelphia on the coast, right? And very mixed up, very diverse population. And what the big draw for Pennsylvania is that you do not have wars with Native American tribes. You don't have conflicts with Native Americans at all because Quakers, and William Penn in particular, keep their promises. And they don't break the treaties to the Native Americans. They don't go into land that isn't theirs. They don't steal land. They buy it. They trade for it. Everything is done, above board and with the consent of the Native Americans. So part of his religion also, but this is a huge sticking point and a huge draw, a pull factor, if you will, for migration to Pennsylvania because, going to war in Massachusetts and Virginia or whatever with the Pequots and the Powhatans, that's dangerous. You could die. So in Pennsylvania, you're safe. Right? And so that's a big draw for them. The Carolinas, again, we're moving on down south, the eastern seaboard here. Originally, it's just one block. Carolina is the female version of the name Charles. That's where they get the name. Originally, it's set up kind of as a buffer against the Spanish in Florida. And the Spanish don't spend a lot of time controlling Florida. There's a lot of Native American tribes there, and they basically use it as a place. They aren't really trying to make a colony out of it. And the issue that they quickly find, at least the southern colonies, is that Native American tribes are more than willing to help escape slaves. And so the colonists don't like that, as you can imagine. And they just want a buffer between the Spanish, although Georgia comes a little bit later and is the actual buffer. But they divide it based on settlers, on who settles there and the kind of economies that they develop. So Northern Carolina is very similar to the other Chesapeake Bay colonies, Maryland, Virginia. They grow tobacco, large land plots, right? Mostly English settlement, enslaved Africans. Southern Carolina, though, is settled by the English from Barbados, from the Caribbean. And they bring with them, enslaved Africans and also free blacks, with skills in different uh, crops. So you start to see rice and indigo and different types of agriculture going on in South Carolina based on the skills that come from the people in the Caribbean. You also see a very interesting culture amongst the free Africans and enslaved Africans in South Carolina, because they all seem to come from a certain area in Africa, and they bring with them, again, their traditions and their music and their skill set. And so South Carolina is really one of those interesting gems, and that it's set apart, right, from the other colonies so far. They formalized the split in 1729, so we're up to North and South Carolina. We did talk about Jamaica, and when they talk about Cromwell, we're talking about that Commonwealth period. It does become a sugar colony. It's the most valuable in the late 18th century. So when we, in a couple chapters, when we start talking about American independence, part of the reason that the British give up or surrender in the American Revolution is because Jamaica is under threat from the French and the Dutch that have pledged support to the Americans. And the English are so hell-bent on protecting Jamaica that they're willing to give up the other 13 colonies just to remain control of Jamaica. Right? And it makes more money, right? Like I said, it's worth more than the other 13 colonies put together in their mind. And the last one that's not on there, though, is Georgia. They may mention it in another chapter, but Georgia is one of the later colonies that's established. It's named after the Georges, right? The Hanoverians that take over after Queen Anne dies. And it's originally started as a penal colony, meaning that's where they take prisoners. Okay? And so they take them there and force them to work. Now that stopped within the first 25 years, but that's how Georgia started, okay, as a prisoner colony. It's not the first time the English have done that. They're going to do that for Australia too. Okay, the English are running out of places to put people. All right, now we actually kind of talked about this already. The Pueblo Revolt in 1680, and what goes on there. But Bacon's Rebellion, which occurs in Jamestown, okay. And again, this is kind of leading off of what the stresses and strains that are going on with the expansion of Jamestown and the other colonies. So you have a guy named Francis Bacon. He is a former indentured servant, and the Virginians are, or at least his group of people, are on the outside of the community. They're trying to push out and get more land, so they begin fighting with the Powhatans, right? Powhatans retaliate. Bacon asks the royal governor for support, and the governor says basically, no, you started that fight, leave them alone, go back to your farms and basically pipe down. Stop being so antagonistic toward Native Americans and they won't come after you. So he is upset by this. So he leads kind of a double-edged war against the Native Americans and the governor. He says that the governor, Berkeley, is corrupt. The governor is appointed by the crown, by the way. And that he's not supporting Native Virginians, or he's not supporting Virginians. Again, he is a recent immigrant, right? He's a former indentured servant. So he's leading this just ridiculous kind of rebellion, they call it. But he is supported by other indentured servants, former indentured servants. He's killed, actually, in 1677. He does have a wound, but they think it's more likely the flu, because he gets a massive fever and chest cold, etc., and he dies. So the rebellion collapses. They sign treaties with the Powhatans. There's a lot of damage to Jamestown. They burn part of it, and this treaty pushes the Virginian Indians west of the Appalachians. So they agree to go west of the mountains. The Virginians stay on, the eastern side of the mountains, and they think that this is going to solve the problem. But what this points out is that you cannot tell the difference between, say, a free Virginian and an indentured servant. They all look the same, right? So this just adds to the pressure to switch from indentured servitude to enslaved Africans. Okay, we originally, when we talked about the starving time, and we went through the Freethorn letter and the document analysis video, the most of the time you have farmers purchasing indentured servants because they don't really have to pony up any money up front. Very little. They just have to pay for their passage. The big balloon payment, again, comes at the end. After they lived out their 7 years, they have to give them either a chunk of land or X amount of money based on the contract. But if they die, which a lot of people died in those first 20 years, right? They got those years of free service without having to pay the end price. The difference between that and an enslaved person is that all of the investment is up front for them. So if you purchase an enslaved person, they are a lot more expensive than, say, an indentured servant, but there's no balloon payment at the end because it never ends, right? It's a lifetime commitment. So you start to see the switch after probably 1630 gradually. They start to bring in more and more enslaved Africans, right? The first, as we know on record, is 1619. But it doesn't become kind of large scale until later in the century, later in the 17th century. And after 1670, it takes off. You don't really see hardly any indentured servants anymore. It's all enslaved Africans, right? And just to kind of as a caveat, right? Everybody understands and knows that slavery is abhorrent. Chattel slavery, or the enslavement of Africans in the transatlantic slave trade, was immoral and totally barbarous, right? Excruciatingly cruel. But we do talk about it because it's part of American history, right? We need to talk about it. So the Atlantic slave trade shifts the focus, right, of the economy to the Atlantic. And I think we've talked about slavery before. Slavery goes back to biblical times. There's been slavery since there have been probably human beings on the planet. But the slavery that occurs in the Atlantic, chattel slavery, is just horrific. It's the likes of which have not been seen in the world's history yet, and hopefully not ever again. Okay? Slavery is the key to this system, this Atlantic trading system. Some people call it the triangular trade. Others just call it the Atlantic slave trade or the slave trade. But it is important to note that it's different from others. The characteristics are that it is a lifetime. It lasts a lifetime. It's inherited, usually through the mothers. It's racially based, racially motivated as well. It's based on labor needs in the sugar plantations originally in the islands off the west coast of Africa, then in the Caribbean, and then into North and South America, right? So the Atlantic slave trade system, or the triangular trade, that makes a point in Africa, picks up enslaved people, goes to the New World, sells those enslaved people, and picks up goods. And they either then go straight to Europe, or they go up to North America and across to Europe, sell those goods, and then bring money and or tradable objects back down to Africa and repeat the thing all over again, right? The thing is, African slave traders were very specific about what they wanted, and if the Europeans didn't have anything to trade that they wanted, they didn't trade them. So most of the time you're looking for firearms, weapons, food, money, right? All of those things. Now the Europeans begin competing for the slave trade, but the Portuguese are first, and they pretty much control it for a huge length of the slave trade. I mean, for almost the entire time it's going. The Dutch do get in on this, and the English as well, because the English, starting in the 18th century, have the largest navy, right? But it will also be the English who put a stop to it. So the Atlantic slave trade is brutal, right? New England and the Caribbean, we said there's a small amount of slavery going on in New England. They export the food and wood to the Caribbean sugar plantations, which they need to boil the sugar down and refine it. The restoration colonies copy the New England model. Restoration colonies are any colonies that happened after the death of Cromwell, so after the Civil War with Charles II coming back. So most of those colonies that we just went over are restoration colonies. Okay, slaving voyages, it's terrible. It's brutal. All right, 10 to 20% die en route. That's a low number. It's just terrible. Let me see if I can pull up some graphics, some pictures for you, and show you these numbers in infographics, because those numbers don't seem quite right. But again, all we have to go off is historical documents or records that are mostly accurate, but you don't know if they're 100% accurate, right? Okay, so let me pull up some graphics here and see if I can show you some things that will help kind of put this in perspective. Okay, so here you see the slave trading routes, and the pie charts dictate the percentage of enslaved people that end up in that area. So you have in the American colonies 10%, in the Caribbean 60%, and in Brazil 40%, and then 10% down in South America. Okay, this kind of shows you the triangular trade, showing about we are picking up through the slave trading post to the slave coast here, bring them across the Atlantic, sell them, pick up goods, either go up to North America or straight back to Europe, sell those goods, pick up money and tradable commodities, and come back down here. All right, so it's like they call it the triangular trade. Oops. Make sure I have that. There we go. Restoration, deportation flows. Okay, yeah, that's the next one. All right, so these are some of the volumes we're talking about between the 15th and 16th century. So 1400 to 1500, these are the numbers you're looking at. Okay, and you do have an East African slave trade that really isn't part of our course, but is also thriving. And the East African slave trade is being run by Muslim Empire, and it's taking them over to Arabia and also further on to Asia. Okay, so this is where we're talking the first 100 years, right? Now, 1700s, look at those numbers. They just explode, right? 7 million people. And that's just to that one area. And so you start to see this explosion of numbers. And what we have to remember is that the enslaved people that end up in North America, most of the time have already been to the Caribbean, right? Less than 10%, around 10% are direct migrants or direct enslaved people from Africa. The rest of them come from the Caribbean. And the Caribbean has, like we said, 60% of enslaved Africans end up in the Caribbean due to the large death rate, right? They keep killing them off. And they're doing that by working them to death and not feeding them. And so it's a very sad state, right? And it's just brutal what these people go through. Very inhumane. And this right here, this graphic will show you when slavery ended, right? England abolishes slavery in 1807, France 1815, Denmark 1792, 1815 for Holland, Portugal not till 1830. But again, these are in Europe. So the Europeans abolished this in their country, but not in their colonies, right? So in 1888, right, 50 some years later, is when slavery is actually abolished in Brazil, which is a Portuguese colony. And 1807, the slave trade is abolished in the United States. You can no longer import enslaved people. That doesn't mean slavery ends. It means the slave trade is no longer allowed, right? And we know that it takes until the end of the Civil War to officially legally end slavery. Right? So those are some graphics to kind of show you numbers that we're talking about here. There were some pictures I wanted to show you. Sorry. Let me pull up MindTap because I know that they have some images about the ships that were happening, the ships in the capacity and how they were transporting enslaved Africans across the Atlantic. Give me a second. Okay. Look into chapter 3. All right. Some pictures of some ships. Okay. Again, there's more maps you can see. We've kind of already gone over that. Sorry, I thought there was an image. I know they're in here. Here we go. Benin. That's pictures of the slave market and moving enslaved people to the ports, and they're going to put them on ships. I thought there was a picture of a slave ship. Okay, well, you know what? There's always Google, right? Here we go. Okay, so as you can see here, start with this one. When they transported enslaved people in these ships, they put them in so close together, and most of the time they left them chained together. And this just creates a terrible situation. The crossing usually lasts 4 to 6 weeks. They rarely get these people out to fresh air. They don't feed them appropriately. Water is not always given, and it's not always fresh. and they're chained in next to each other. If somebody dies and they don't realize it right away, you're chained next to a corpse. In addition to that, you also have people who are seasick, right? Who are not used to being on ships, as you can imagine. So there's vomit running around, and everybody has got to use the bathroom every day, sometimes multiple times a day. So this is happening, and there's no cleaning going on. And so it's just a terrible, terrible place. Just horrible. Um, you know, a ring of hell. And you have a good slave trading ship. Good, I mean, like they managed to get a lot of their product, or they managed to keep the enslaved people alive, are the people who take them out every day, who allow them to walk around, who feed them better, who make sure they have water, clean up where they are. But then you have some voyages in which they pack these people in there like that and leave them there for 6 weeks. But they also lose a lot of lives to that. And sometimes they'll dump them overboard. So you also see some tampering with the numbers because they don't, the ship's captain doesn't want to report to the owner that he's lost all his cargo, right? All his money. But they start to dump bodies as soon as they get close to the Caribbean because that's where the sharks are, right? And so the sharks are the slave ships for that reason. And you do have some instances of slaves killing themselves, but they don't really record it that way. They just record it as a death. So we don't know how many did that. And you can imagine just the absolute despair because they don't know how long this voyage is. They don't know where they're going. They just know they've been kidnapped from their family. And now they're in this terrible, terrible place. People are treating them, lower than animals. They take care of livestock better than they're taking care of these people, right? So it's just a horrible situation, the gravity of which I don't even know if a lot of people understand, right? Or are even willing to understand, especially in kind of the situation or the, how do I want to put this? The ideas about it that are going around today, right? The mindset of people in present day. I know that there's, right, I'm speaking to the choir really because I'm sure you and I understand this, but there's a lot of people in the United States that do not. And, right, you see this influx of white supremacy and they're totally ignorant. And you see people throw out things like, well, the Irish were enslaved too. No, the Irish were usually indentured servants. This type of slavery, this chattel slavery, the transatlantic slave trade, is its own beast. It is completely separate. The likes of which have not been seen, like I said, before or since. There is no comparison to this, right? This system is absolute cruelty. Okay. Now, let me go ahead and stop there and ask you guys if you have any questions about what we've gone over, and make sure that you have your name in the chat so I can record the attendance. And the slides that I used today are all up on Blackboard under course content. So you'll always have that. But do you all have any questions over the plagiarism quiz, mind tap, progress reports, any of that?
I have a question.
Yes.
So I did